Friends, thank you for your commitment today. Disciples of Jesus are nothing if we're not lifelong learners on his way. And those of us who are entrusted with particular roles and responsibilities in the Church of God are nothing if we are not first and foremost disciples of the Lord. So today is an investment in our shared learning. And I do hope that you already feel as if you've had a worthwhile day. I, for one, am enormously grateful to Bishop Rachel for her lecture this morning and for all the work that she's been doing to put her finger on a subject we're all aware of, but haven't been destructive. And I hope that today will leave you feeling more motivated and better equipped to challenge those expectations and in offering support to the young people in our schools and church families. So to supplement what Bishop Rachel has shared with us, I want to take a look at the book of Esther and at the first two chapters in particular. After all, it's a fair question to ask whether these chapters do not make the problem worse. Do they not in fact exemplify the behaviours and attitudes which are precisely the ones we want to challenge? Are they not in fact a hindrance to us in the struggle against identity and not a help? You see, in Esther chapter 1, a drunk and extremely powerful man called King Ahasuerus or Xerxes, it's the same name, derived the former Ahasuerus from the Hebrew and Xerxes from the Greek. This extremely powerful drunk man in the middle of a men-only banquet orders his wife, Queen Vashti, to join them. The text is explicit. He wanted to show the peoples and the officials her beauty, for she was fair to behold. That's Esther chapter 1, verse 11. What is that, if not deplorable gender oppression, the crass exploitation of a woman for male pleasure? But it gets worse. Queen Vashti, presumably because she feels demeaned, refuses the order, and for this she's deposed. It is decided that her royal position must be given to someone better than she is. That's chapter 1, verse 19. The reason for this drastic move is simple. If Vashti is not severely punished, then, and this is verse 17, this deed of the queen will be made known to all women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands. All over the empire, noble ladies, you'll find those exact words in verse 18, noble ladies who have heard of the queen's behavior will rebel against their menfolk, and there will be no end of contempt and wrath. Imagine an patriarchy, how terrible. That's chapter 1. But it gets worse again. In chapter 2, in order to find a queen better than Vashti, what is the discernment process? Well, beautiful virgins from all over the empire are sought and gathered into the imperial harem, and then one by one they're served up to the king for his delectation, and the one who pleases the king most is to be queen. That's chapter 2, verses 1 to 4. Enter Esther, who is indeed fair and beautiful, verse 7. And lo and behold, when it was her turn to be taken to the king, he loved her more than all the other women. Of all the virgins, she won his favour and devotion, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. That's verse 17. It is enough to make you squirm, isn't it? It calls to my mind that ugly video, which in retrospect should surely have cost President Trump the election in 2016. Not just Vashti and Esther, but all the beautiful virgins who did not win the beauty contest, and all the noble ladies of the empire who can't be trusted to make wise decisions for themselves and for their households. All of them are treated as second-class citizens, as objects whose value is determined by their beauty and by their ability in bed and out of bed to please their menfolk. So the question arises whether our Bibles would not be more edifying and more suited to the challenges of our times if we were quietly to drop these two chapters or the whole book of Esther from the canon. Well, obviously, my answer to that question is no, certainly not. Our Bibles would not be more edifying or more suited to the challenges of our times if we were quietly to delete this material. But at this point, I have to acknowledge the fact that in what follows, I am undeniably, inevitably offering a straight, male, and pretty binary perspective on this text, and you will see at once the irony of a heterosexual male defense of these chapters. But I have tried to engage with female and indeed feminist readings, and I've dipped my toe in the water of queer readings of the text, and I hope that will be evident. I'm aware of the obvious sense, for example, in which the story of Esther can be read as a coming out story, in which she has to calculate with courage the implications of making public her Jewishness. And I'm aware too how easy it is to airbrush out of this story the critical part played by a dozen or more named eunuchs. There are more named eunuchs in the book of Esther than in every other book of the Bible put together. I do want to commend to you the outstanding commentary by the Jewish scholar Adele Berlin, to which I owe most, and the commentaries by Karen Jobes and Deborah Reed. But beyond that, I'm afraid you will have to bear with the limitations of my own perspectives. As an aside, let me observe that it's surely no coincidence, but reflects the extent to which biblical scholarship is still far too much dominated by men, that the book of Esther, rather than say the book of Amos, is particularly well served by commentaries written by women. That's just by the by. So if the solution to the problem I've outlined is not quietly to drop the book of Esther from the canon, what is the solution? I want to suggest it is to read this brilliantly subversive story as it was always intended that we should read it. In other words, I want to suggest that the book of Esther is ahead of us. I'll try to demonstrate that the book of Esther was signed up to project L'identity centuries before we coined the phrase. So what I want to do for the next half hour is first to show you the structure of the book. Then I'm going to canter through a potted version of the story. And then finally, I want to say two things about its values. And that's where I hope to convince you that this text challenges any sexist assumption that the value of a woman is determined by her capacity to please a man. You may find it helpful to have the handout open before you. It'll help you to follow my train of thought. And you may all the more like to have a copy of the scriptures to hand. You'll find Esther after Ezra and Nehemiah and before Job and the Psalms. So in a moment, I'll try to summarize the plot in case you don't know it or don't know it well, but also, frankly, just because it is such a rollicking good tale and because we don't tell it often enough in church. But first, I want to talk you through the careful structure of the book, because Esther is one of those books of the Bible whose message is closely linked to its structure. Actually, as you will have heard me say often, although Holy Scripture is always more than carefully crafted literature, it is in fact seldom less than that, and Esther is another case in point. I've tried to set out the structure on the handout. The climax of our story comes in the middle, in chapter 6, when the Persian emperor called Xerxes in, for example, the NIV, and Ahasuerus in, for example, the NRSV, has a sleepless night. Either side of that central scene, the story is made up of a whole series of matching pairs of episodes. So there are two banquets hosted by Queen Esther in chapters 5 and 7. Then two stories about Mordecai and Esther planning to rescue the Jews in chapters 4 and 8. Then two stories about the plot of Haman to kill the Jews in chapter 3, where his threat is set out, and in chapter 9, in which it is thwarted. So in chapter 3, you get references to an edict of the king and a throwing of the dice. And in chapter 8, you get a second edict. And in chapter 9, a second reference to the throwing of a dice. And finally, either side of those stories are the introduction in chapters 1 to 2 and the conclusion in chapter 10. And like a thread running through the whole book is the Hebrew word mishteh, which occurs 20 times in this book and only 24 times in the whole of the rest of the Old Testament. So it's a special word for the writer of Esther. Your English translation probably translates mishteh inconsistently, sometimes as banquet and sometimes as feast. And that's frustrating because it disguises a pattern. In Esther, the banquets come in pairs. There are two at the start of the book, two in the middle, and two at the end, each pair linked to a particular reversal. So the two banquets in chapters 1 and 2 frame the fall of Vashti and the rise of Esther. The two banquets in chapters 5 and 7, hosted by Esther, trigger the fall of Haman and the rise of Mordecai. And the two in chapters 8 and 9 celebrate the fall of the enemies of the Jews and the rise of the Jews themselves. This use of symmetry, or chiasm, as it's technically called, is a shrewd choice to convey a story which, as the narrator puts it in chapter 9, verse 22, is a story of how sorrow was turned to gladness and grief into festival. Esther is the story of two pairs of individual reversals, Vashti and Esther, Haman and Mordecai, caught up in one big reversal of fortune concerning the Jews in Persia. And in that sense, it prefigures the gospel of the kingdom. And in particular, it prefigures both the words of Jesus, the first shall be last and the last shall be first, and the experience of Jesus, in whose resurrection defeat is turned to final victory. That should already alert us to the fact that this is not a text designed to demean women. I hope you're still with me, so let me try to summarize the story. This is foolhardy, actually, because it has been so skillfully written under the guiding hand of the Holy Spirit that any attempt to praise it is also bound to diminish it. But if by the end of this afternoon I've whet your appetite to reread it later, I shall consider this a job well done. In chapter 1, we're introduced to mighty Xerxes, emperor of Persia, between about 486 and 465 BC, ruler of a kingdom which stretched from India to Ethiopia. In the third year of his reign, he's giving a banquet. This was a proper banquet. It lasted a week, but it came at the end of 180 days of celebration, 6 months, give or take. And his queen gave her own party for the women. On the 7th day of the banquet, Xerxes called for Vashti. He wanted to show her off to his guests because she was gorgeous, the ultimate trophy wife, but she refused to come. I accept that this may not exactly have been an early blow for feminism, but I do think the Bible writer means us to be shocked by the inappropriateness of Xerxes' request, and therefore impressed by the defiance of her response. He may have ruled over 127 provinces, but his own wife resisted him, seeking to preserve her dignity in a situation in which the men had sacrificed theirs. But she paid a heavy price, and Xerxes banished her from his presence for life for insubordination and declared a beauty contest to find a new wife. In chapter 2, auditions begin, and one of the participants is a Jewish orphan called Esther, or Hadassah, who lives with her uncle Mordecai. Each entrant is given 12 months of beauty treatments and is then led to the king. In the evening, she went in to him, and in the morning she came back, and she would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. The sexual euphemisms are clear. Whatever her charms, Esther apparently pleased the king more than any of her rivals, and she became the new queen. Now, Mordecai liked to loiter near the king's courts for news of his niece, and one particular day he overheard a plot to kill the king and reported it via Esther so that the plotters were killed. That put him literally in the king's good books. His name was written into the royal chronicle, and at this point the plot is set up. Both Esther and Mordecai are in positions of influence, able to intervene when the crisis comes. Chapter 3 then introduces us to the last of the major characters in the book. Haman was one of Xerxes' chief officers and was held in high regard. In fact, the king had commanded ordinary people to bow down to Haman, but Mordecai, loitering near the palace, wouldn't do it. The text is explicit that he wouldn't do it because he was a Jew. The text is implicit, I think, that he wouldn't do it because he knew obeisance belonged to God alone. But this infuriated Haman so much that he hatched a plot to have not just Mordecai, but all the Jews slaughtered. Haman persuaded Xerxes that Jews were a threat to national security, and the king signed an edict, and the law of the Medes and the Persians could not be broken. Once signed, the king's decree could never be revoked to order the killing of the Jews. And they cast lots, in Hebrew, the pur, to determine when the slaughter would take place, and the lot fell on the 14th day of the month of Adar, about 11 months away. In chapter 4, Mordecai hears about the king's edict and goes into public mourning because of the disaster that has befallen his people. Esther hears about her uncle's grief, and in her distress, she sends a messenger to Mordecai to find out what has happened. He sends a message back to Esther, explaining the situation and asking her to beg the king for mercy. She reminds her uncle that under palace rules, if you enter the king's presence without permission, you risk your life. If the king does not extend his scepter towards you, you're dead. And then Mordecai makes the most faith-filled speech in the book. Don't think you'll escape just because you're the queen, Esther, he says. If you stay silent, relief and deliverance for the Jews will come from another source. And who knows, maybe you have come to a royal position for such a time as this. We'll come back to those words later. In chapter 5, Esther takes her life in her hands and enters the king's throne room. This is the inversion of Vashti's experience. When the king summoned her, she asserted herself by refusing to enter his presence. Esther now asserts herself by entering his presence unsummoned, and the reader waits with bated breath to see if she will suffer her predecessor's fate. But he extends his scepter to her and asks her what she wants. Esther has now emerged from the shadow of two men. At this point, she's no longer Mordecai's niece or Xerxes' wife, but an agent in her own right. Please will you and Haman come to a banquet at my house, she asks. The king agrees, sends for Haman, and that night they go. And at the banquet, the king says, come on, Esther, you must want something. What is it? You're right, she says. I want you and Haman to come back for another banquet tomorrow night. Now Haman cannot believe his luck. He's had a private dinner with the king and queen tonight, and he's been invited back for another tomorrow night. So he's on his way home, happy as can be, when he runs into Mordecai. And at that point, he's filled with rage because Mordecai still will not bow down in homage to him. So he gets home and complains to his wife, I've got all this stuff, all this power, but I can't be happy while Mordecai is around. Fine, she says, build a gallows 75 feet high, then ask the king's permission to hang Mordecai on it. So Haman goes to bed that night, happy and presumably to sleep like a baby. Unfortunately, the king can't sleep. So in chapter 6, the pivotal chapter, we hear how he gets someone to read him a bedtime story from the chronicles of his reign. And what do they read but the story about the time that Mordecai reported to the king the plots to assassinate him? Wait, says the king, what did we ever do to reward this Mordecai? He asks. Nothing, he's told. By then it's dawn, and Haman has come to ask the king about the gallows. But before he can say a word, the king says, hey man, what should I do for the man I want to honor? There's a fabulous literary wit involved at this point, because the reader knows the king's desire to honor Mordecai, which Haman does not, and about Haman's desire to kill the Jews, which the king does not. And Haman thinks to himself, who could the king possibly want to honor except me? So he says to the king, put that man on the king's own horse and in the king's royal robes and walk him through the city with someone in high office going in front of the horse shouting, look what the king does for the man he wants to honor. Good plan, says the king. You can be the man in high office. I want you to go and find the Jew Mordecai and do for him exactly what you've suggested. So Haman has to do as the king says, and then flees home to his wife in humiliation. In chapter 7, it's Mordecai's second banquet. And sure enough, the king says to her, now then, Esther, what is it you really want? So she tells him that a man has tricked the king into agreeing to the slaughter of her people. Who is this villain, the king demands. Haman, she says, pointing at him. The king is so angry, he goes outside for a moment to compose himself. And while he's gone, Haman throws himself onto Esther for mercy. But when the king comes back, what he sees is Haman lying on top of his queen on her couch, apparently molesting her. Right, he says, that's it, you're dead meat. And it looks like there's a convenient gallows outside. They'll do for you. So Haman is hanged, hoist, as it were, by his own petard. But in chapter 8, we find there is still a problem. The king has, after all, issued a decree, and by that decree, the Jews are to be slaughtered on a fixed date. And according to Persian law, the decree of the king cannot be revoked, so the Jews are still under threat. What is to be done? Well, Mordecai comes up with a cunning plan and gets the king to issue a second decree to say that the Jews are entitled to fight back. They can arm and defend themselves and even help themselves to the property of any of their enemies who may be killed. And the decree added that anyone who chose to help the Jews against those who hated them would have the king's blessing. In chapter 9, the day of the planned slaughter comes, and sure enough, the Jews are attacked. But they're able to defend themselves, and it's their enemies who come off worse. The Jews kill 75,000 of those who hated them, but they're very restrained, and they don't touch the plunder that the king had said they could take. The text stresses that repeatedly, but they did not touch the plunder. That doesn't, of course, quite eliminate the disturbing impression a Christian reader receives at such a bloody slaughter, unless that is the whole narrative is to be read as a dark pantomime rather than as a work of literal history. Even then, I'm afraid, there are accounts of recent acts of terror committed by zealous Jews, fueled precisely by the reading or misreading of this text. Chapter 9 ends by recording how this event became an annual feast and celebration for the Jews, when they remember how Haman cast lots to fix the day of their slaughter. And because the Hebrew for lot is pur, and the feast is called by the plural Purim, and it's still celebrated by the Jews every year. Indeed, this year it's in just over a fortnight's time on the 25th of February. Chapter 10 rounds off the story pretty much as a happy ever after. It tells how Mordecai continued to prosper as the chief minister of King Xerxes. There's something intensely realistic and historically credible about that. Esther may have played the crucial part in rescuing the people, but she can't be prime minister. That office goes to her uncle. That's the story. So what might it have to say about the true value of women and about male-dominated cultures? Two things I want to suggest. I want to say something, first of all, about the apparent absence of God in this story and the prominence of chance. And then something, secondly, about the humour of the book. I want to ask why the book of Esther pokes fun and at whom. First of all, then, something about chance and the absence of God. As most of you are surely aware, the word God does not occur even once in the canonical book of Esther, not once. The only other book of the Bible in which that's true is the Song of Songs, but that's a series of poetic texts, and somehow the omission is less startling there. Esther is a narrative account of a Jewish woman who became the queen of a Gentile nation at a time when her people faced the threat of a severe persecution. In that context, the absence of any reference to God is genuinely surprising. But there's also no reference to temple or sacrifice, to prayer or Sabbath keeping, to kosher food laws or circumcision, all the key markers of what it meant to be Jewish in the late Old Testament era, in the parts of our Bible which date from the exilic and post-exilic periods, are missing. Just by the way, the Septuagint, which was the basis for the 4th century Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible, which still underlies most Roman Catholic versions in English, including the Jerusalem Bible and the New Jerusalem Bible, adds 107 additional verses to the Hebrew text. This extra material, which in Anglican versions is generally placed in the Apocrypha, does contain at least 40 references to God, which only underlines the oddity of the original Hebrew text. God is conspicuous by his absence. The name of the Feast of Purim likewise only serves to reinforce the fact that God does not say or do anything directly in this book. Purim is the only major annual festival to have originated after the conquest and outside the Promised Land. And Pur, as I say, means dice or lot. The Feast of Purim is the feast of chance, the festival of coincidence. And Purim, of course, refers not only to the casting of lots in chapter 3, verse 7 and chapter 9, verse 27, but to the whole string of unlikely coincidences in the text. So Esther just happened to be beautiful and to be chosen as queen to Xerxes at just the time when the Jews were in danger. Mordecai just happened to overhear a plot to kill the king. The king just happened to be sleepless one night and to ask for a bedtime story. He just happened to hear the story of Mordecai's finest hour, just when the threat to the Jews was at its most extreme. Haman just happened to enter the court at precisely the wrong moment, so he ended up honoring the one man he really didn't want to, and so on. And yet there is no doubt, in spite of his absence, that God is the chief actor in this drama. He is not named, he does not speak or act, he is not even said to be influencing events, and yet his hand is at work behind these coincidences for all who have eyes to see it. The nearest we get to any declaration of faith is that assurance by Mordecai to Esther that if she remains silent, help for the Jews will nevertheless arise from another source, coupled with his suggestion that she's been placed in a royal position for such a time as this. It's pretty clear that Mordecai has faith in the providence of God. He trusts that however absent God may seem, he is in fact shaping history and fulfilling his purpose for his people and for individuals. And perhaps more surprisingly, Haman's wife, a woman called Zeresh, also intuits the providence of God. She tells Haman in chapter 6, verse 13, "If Mordecai, before whom your downfall has begun, is of the Jewish people, you will not prevail against him." She means, in that case, you will find yourself fighting against God. A Jewish commentator has written, God may not reveal himself openly. His word may not be spoken, his face may not be seen, but under the veil of coincidence, he fulfills his will for his people. And part of the point of the book is this, that the Lord is as likely to be invisibly at work in and through the agency of women as of men, and perhaps more likely. In that culture, after all, the women were generally regarded as weak and foolish, and our God has always delighted in choosing the weak to shame the strong and the foolish to shame the wise. In other words, the text invites us to see what poor indicators of true greatness and true significance the usual worldly measures of money, sex, and power actually are. In this story, those are held, as they are still too often held, by men. But for all their huffing and puffing, Xerxes and Haman turn out to be inconsequential to the outcome of this story, or even as obstacles to it. It is the women, including the pagans, Vashti and Zeresh, as well as Jewish Esther, who are more in tune, I suggest, with that hidden but nevertheless guiding providence of God. That's the first thing. Just before I leave the issue of the hiddenness of God in Esther, I should just note the four possible acrostics of the tetragrammaton Yahweh in chapter 1, verse 20, chapter 5, verse 4, chapter 5, verse 13, and chapter 7, verse 7. I can tell you that I have checked the Hebrew, and it is perfectly true that the four letters Yod, Heth, War, Heth do indeed occur in sequence as the initial letters of four consecutive words in each of those four verses. Whether or not these are deliberate acrostics buried in the text as parables, if you like, for the hiddenness of God in the story, or are sheer coincidence, I can't make up my mind. On balance, I suppose it would be a funny coincidence if in a book about coincidence, they really are there by sheer coincidence. Secondly, and finally, let me say something about the humor of the book. The book of Esther is supposed to make us laugh. And that's a bit surprising given the plot. The proposed destruction of the people of God in itself is no laughing matter. But this is a book which, as one commentator puts it, resists solemn exegesis. It teeters constantly on the brink of slapstick. Berlin calls it burlesque. Somehow, the extreme numbers and hyperbole, the 180-day party, the 12-month-long beauty treatments, the gallows 50 cubits high, Haman's offer to contribute 10,000 talents to the king's coffers, the 75,000 enemy dead, and the repetition of all and every, all the king's officials, all the women, all the king's servants, all the Jews, all his friends, every province, every people, every man, every day, every city, every year, every generation, every family. The misunderstandings and the cross purposes, the bawdiness and farce create a panto mood. In chapter 1, for example, the two lists of names in verses 10 and 14, Bizthar, Bigthar, Abagthar, Zethar, Admathar, Mehuman and Memucan, apparently these are not quite recognizable Persian names, but comic caricatures, and the lists would have provided Jewish audiences at the time with an excuse to giggle. From the moment Xerxes, the ruler of a vast empire, hosting such an extravagant party, gets stood up by his wife, to the moment he reads his own royal chronicles as a cure for his insomnia, to the moment that the king of Persia has to issue a second unbreakable edict to cancel out the first one, from the moment Haman first has to honor Mordecai, to the moment he is hanged on the very scaffold he's prepared for his enemy, the comedy is at the heart of this book. Why? Well, the book of Esther, for all its deadly serious plot, pokes fun at human politics, and in particular at rulers who take themselves too seriously, and frankly, at men who take themselves too seriously. Think of Psalm 2 and you won't be too far away. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and its rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. But he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord has them in derision. When we read Esther, the book draws us into the laughter of God at the godless culture of the Persian court. And here's the vital point I want to make. The book succeeds, I think, in a subtle and indirect way at showing up and ridiculing the sexism of Xerxes. He might play the chauvinist with Vashti, but his power is first resisted by her and then shrewdly steered by his Jewish queen. He behaves as if luxury and lawmaking are marks not just of a great ruler, but of a great human, but he's shown up as a fool. Or take Haman, whose deluded self-importance and then his impotent fury are contrasted not just with the humility and quiet dignity of Mordecai, but with the solemn wisdom of his wife, Zeresh, and most of all with the selfless courage of Queen Esther. And if you have winced your way this last week through the video of Hanford Parish Council, you'll be aware that Xerxes and Haman, Vashti and Esther have their counterparts today. Yet, as we laugh at Xerxes and as we laugh at Haman, male readers with even an ounce of self-awareness also laugh a bit nervously at ourselves, at the Xerxes and Haman in ourselves, at our tendency to get up ourselves and to take ourselves too seriously. But of course, it's not just men who have at least the faint echo of an inner Xerxes or an inner Haman. And the book of Esther urges every one of us, selfish human beings that we are, to rein in those dark impulses within us. So, in laughing at the Xerxes and Haman in ourselves, whoever we are, male or female or non-binary, we also give grateful thanks to God for every Esther, Vashti, and even Zeresh, whom God daily gives to chasten us. And we give glory to the God who in his grace saves us time and time again from ourselves. Thank you for listening. We're going to go into a break now. And when we return at, Bill, can I suggest 25 past? It will be for half an hour of conversation about this extraordinary text. Some of you will know it well and may be regretting the fact that I've glossed over a part of it which is precious to you. You might even feel that I've glossed over it all too predictably. Or you may feel that you've detected moments in which, in my exposition of the text, I was skating on thin ice, rather like the lecturer who had written into the margin of his typescript, argument weak here, speak louder. Well, if so, then probe that bit when we return, please. I was going to encourage you to feel free to take issue with the bishop. But reflecting back on this occasion in previous years, I don't remember that the Q&A felt particularly subdued or inhibited. The truth is that God has given Holy Scripture to the church and that we read it best when we read it together. So I'm going to be seriously disappointed if my appreciation of the Book of Esther has not been deepened and enriched by 3 p.m. So do please come back ready to contribute to the conversation in 15 minutes. Thank you.